All right, welcome to Block 9, the notes on 1861. So the first shots have been fired on Fort Sumter, and the United States is now dealing with a civil war. All of the material advantages would seem to lie with the North, while some of the more strategic advantages seem to lie with the South. The first thing both sides had to worry about was raising the armies themselves. And in April of 1861, the United States Army, which became, the core of the Union Army, was very small. Only about 16,000 men, mostly spread out all over the frontier, keeping the peace between settlers and Indians. Of those 16,000 men from the South, most of them went back to their native states and joined the new Confederate armies. Most United States officers from the South remained loyal to their states and also left the regular army and went south. Some Southern officers did stay with the Union Army throughout the course of the war, but most of them did not. Lincoln knew off the bat that the United States would be relying heavily on state militias. So the first thing he did, he called up 75,000 militiamen for 3 months of service. But he recognized that the war was not going to be over in 90 short days, so he authorized another 42,000 volunteers. He also authorized the regular army increasing by 23,000. These tens of thousands of troops were a lot for the United States, but as events would soon show, they were not going to be nearly sufficient. The North had no problem finding volunteers, nor did the South. And when we look back at history and ask what was the average Civil War soldier like, all these tens and then hundreds of thousands of men that joined the armies, most of them willingly, most of them were volunteers, what was the average soldier life like? Well, the average soldier was 26 years old. The vast majority of soldiers were between the age of 18 and 39, and 18-year-olds formed the largest number. There were more 18-year-olds than anybody else in the early armies of the Civil War. But the average soldier was 26. The average soldier was about 5'7", and the average soldier weighed about 140 pounds. They were not big people. And then with the 60, 70, or 80-pound pack that they carried on their back, it certainly made for some interesting marching. People from all walks of life became soldiers, but the most common profession of people who did become soldiers were farmers. Now, the way that the armies themselves were set up was interesting. Every town or neighborhood, if you decided to volunteer with your friends, with your buddies, you would stay together. So let's say we all lived in a little town, and there were farms all around. When Lincoln called for volunteers, everyone who was interested would go into town to the local recruiting station and would sign up. And then they would all go to training together. So these local men and boys formed companies from local towns and neighborhoods. And you would stay with the people you signed up with right through your service. Many times, if a bunch of us kind of signed up, we would pick one of us to be our company commander. And that person, when they kind of got officially in the army, would become the company sergeant. Staying together had positives and negatives. First of all, it kind of kept up morale. That if we want to go together, me and my buddy, then me and my buddy are going to deal with soldiering together. You're not just putting a bunch of random strangers in one big group. The downside, of course, in heavy action, me and all my neighbors could theoretically be wiped out in one action. And it happened throughout the course of the war that entire towns and entire neighborhoods lost the youth of their town, or a large percentage of it, in one single action. That entire neighborhoods, the boys of that neighborhood could be wiped out in one single action. So we have our company. From the 3rd Ward of Elizabeth, all the boys from the 3rd Ward signed up, we elected a sergeant, and then we would be combined with other companies to form a regiment. And each state was responsible for a certain number of regiments. So if we signed up from the 3rd Ward of Elizabeth, we would be glomped in with a bunch of other companies from New Jersey, directed by the state of New Jersey. Okay? That the state of New Jersey had to fill 20 regiments. So if we were the first one to be filled up, we would be known as the 1st New Jersey. And that is how regiments were numbered, were named in the Civil War. The 1st New Jersey, the 2nd New Jersey, the 3rd New Jersey, the 4th New Jersey, the 26th New York, the 44th Pennsylvania, the 62nd Virginia, the 81st South Carolina. And when you look at Civil War histories and Civil War battles and stuff like that, that is how regiments were named. United States troops, the regular army, would simply be called the 1st United States or the 2nd United States. But almost everybody was in a state regiment. And the regiment would be kind of your home, that you'd have your own regimental flag and your own regimental, musical calls and your own regimental cook. And it kind of created cultures within the army. And the men got very, very close, as men in war often do. And you kind of protected your regiment's colors. Your regiment's flag became, really, really important to you, and you would protect that flag in battle. Because to get your flag captured was kind of the ultimate insult to your regiment. The states would be responsible for selecting officers for these regiments. So once we had our regiment, the 1st New Jersey, the governor of New Jersey would pick somebody to be the colonel in charge, and they would probably have some kind of military experience or militia experience, and then we would have our company, our sergeants would be elected by ourselves very often, and our officers would be appointed by the state of New Jersey. So off we marched. Off we marched to war, and morale in 1861 was very, very high. There was a lot of excitement. This was exciting! For people who live their lives on farms, when, one day is pretty much the same as the next. The sun comes up, you work until the sun goes down, you go to sleep. You wake up when the sun comes up, you work until the sun goes down, and you go to sleep. This was new, this was exciting. A bunch of young, excitable men all together, training and drilling, saving the Union from the North, or, whipping the damn Yankees, rear ends if you're from the South. There's an incredible amount of excitement. Neither the North or the South had any problem filling up its armies. Often, somebody wealthy in town would equip his own regiment and put himself in command as captain of the regiment. He paid for our uniforms, he would pay for our supplies, he would pay for our weapons, he would pay for our ammunition, and then he would declare himself captain of our regiment. And that happened thousands of times. That at the beginning at least, both rich and poor, in a patriotic fervor of excitement, joined the colors. Colorful uniforms, very, very popular. Military pageantry. Officers would put on, the gold buttons and the sash and the epaulets. Zouave fever swept both North and South as regiments on both sides tried to look better than anyone else. Zouaves were, and you see the picture in your notes, French colonial troops that wore big baggy red pants and uniforms with sashes and fezzes on it, and that was considered to be the height of military style. So on both sides of the conflict, wealthy people outfitted their regiments like Zouaves and marched off to war. Both sides expected to be home by Christmas. Both sides expected the war to be quick and easy. The North said, we're going to march to Richmond, the capital of the South, and after we capture Richmond, the rebellion will be over. That a bunch of dirty, ignorant Southerners cannot match the efficiency and the technology of the North. And Southerners felt that the North was a bunch of yellow-bellied cowards who couldn't fight, that, they were sickly from working in factories and in big slums and cities. And Southerners felt that once the Northern armies met the power of Southern steel and Southern willpower and Southern resolve, they would lose the will to fight and let the South have their independence. So both sides were kind of marching around, not really knowing what the hell they were doing, thinking that they were going to be home by Christmas. By the summer of 1861, several 100,000 men, most of them lacking any sort of military training, are under arms for both sides. To train to be a soldier takes a long time. It doesn't take 2 weeks, to learn how to march and all the different maneuvers and who to listen to, and which bugle calls are yours, and what do they mean, how to load the rifle under fire, how to load it from a laying down position, a crouch position, a standing position. It's hard, and it takes time, and neither one of these armies that are forming, one around Washington, D.C. and one around Richmond, Virginia, are particularly well trained. Then, on top of that, the national economies were completely overwhelmed trying to equip and get enough boots and uniforms for these men. There was no regular uniform. Some Southerners wore blue, people wore green, some people, if they were outfitted by their own company commander, wore red. It was a colossal mishmashed jumble of eager men. At the helm of the Union armies, at the head of the Union armies, is old General Winfield Scott, the hero of the Mexican War. We've seen him in the past. He has been, by 1861, he has been a general in the United States Army for 47 years. He is 74 years old. He is old, he is infirm, he is well over 300 pounds, he is not well, he cannot even get up on a horse to review troops or to ride out in the field. However, General Scott's mind was still good, and he concocted a plan that he thought would end the rebellion and win the war, and it became known as the Anaconda Plan. General Scott did not join in the rest of the North in thinking that the war would be quick and easy and over by Christmas. Therefore, he formulated a very strategically sound plan that became known as the Anaconda Plan. Now, do we know an anaconda is a big giant snake that wraps itself around its victim and squeezes it until it can't breathe. It asphyxiates it. It takes its breath away. It suffocates it. And his plan became known as the Anaconda Plan. He would use the United States Navy to blockade southern ports. That means American naval ships would be stationed outside of southern ports, and those ships would prevent ships from leaving and prevent ships from going in. That's known as a blockade. The blockade would cut off the South's ability to trade cotton. And as we saw, the South imagined that its ability to sell and trade cotton was at the heart of its potential success. General Scott said, let's use the Navy to blockade the South to prevent them from buying finished goods and from selling cotton. General Scott also wanted a Union army to travel down the Mississippi River and cut the Confederacy in half, to cut Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas off from the rest of the South. General Scott knew that many of the horses that were used came from those areas west of the Mississippi. Much of the food in the South was grown in those areas west of the Mississippi. Scott wanted to take an army, drive down the river, cut the South in half. Therefore, Scott reasoned, with half of the Confederacy cut off and her ports blockaded, the rest of the Union Army could slowly and surely wear down the Confederacy until the war was won. It is strategically a very sound plan. And in fact, that's pretty much what ended up happening. But in 1861, with the excitement and the fervor and people's desire, to go to war immediately, march on to Richmond, end the thing now, people laughed at Scott's plan. The term Anaconda Plan was used negatively to say that Scott was a big, fat, lazy snake that would just kind of smush the Confederacy without taking any bold and decisive action. For that reason, people wanted a quick march to Washington, and they thought that would be easy as pie to do. Rumors start to, swirl, and rumors start to flow that General Scott, whose old nickname was Old Fuss and Feathers from his heroic days in the Mexican War, was too old for the job, was too unwell for the job. And the nickname that started to circulate given to General Scott was no longer Old Fuss and Feathers, but Old Fat and Feeble. And General Scott really started to become something of a pathetic figure around Washington. One of the things that Scott has to do is appoint a field commander. He is too old and unwell to physically take the field of battle himself, so he looks to find a field commander to take command of this huge army that is starting to build and develop around Washington, D.C. And he first offers his command to a gentleman from Virginia by the name of Robert E. Lee. Lee is referred to by Scott as the finest soldier he has ever seen. Lee had served as the chief of engineers under Scott in the Mexican War. Lee, your notes say he's an elite slave owner. That is wrong. Lee owned no slaves. He had plenty of blacks working for him, but they were hired hands. Lee did not own slaves, although his family did. He did not like slavery. He did not want to see the Union break apart. He did not want to see the South secede. He did not want to see Virginia secede. But when President Lincoln fired on Fort Sumter and Lee's beloved home, Virginia, seceded, Lee felt that there was only one thing, Lee said in a letter, that could make him give up his commission as a United States officer, and that was if the United States was going to raise its sword against Virginia. And since Lincoln had pretty much said, yes, I am going to raise my sword against Virginia, Lee felt that his honor had no way to be satisfied except by resigning his commission. So Scott asked Lee to lead the Union armies, and Lee thought on it for several days. But he eventually decided that his loyalty was to his state, his home state. He resigned his commission and went home saying that he would never draw his sword again except to defend Virginia. He sent a letter like this to General Scott, and the two parted in mutual respect. Lee, of course, will be called on by the South and will become the greatest commander the South has, and perhaps the greatest commander in all of American history. So Scott has to go to a second choice. His second choice is a general by the name of Irvin McDowell. All right, so we start with Scott, and then we have McDowell. Keep track of these. There's a lot of them. General McDowell takes command of the day-to-day operations of the army around Washington. And immediately, as soon as McDowell takes command, people start saying, all right, time to march to Richmond. Let's go. Crush the rebellion. Take the army. March it to Richmond. It'll be easy as pie. Rebellion over. And we get to the first real battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run. In the early heady days of the war, both sides believed, like we said, that they could easily march on each other's capital. Now, if you look at the map, Washington and Richmond are only separated by about 80 miles. In the south, on to Washington was the cry heard in the newspapers and on the streets, and in the north, on to Richmond resounded across northern towns, cities, and farms. Both sides have untrained green troops, and McDowell complained about this to President Lincoln. He said, Mr. President, the troops are green. They can't fight. They are not trained. They're green. And Lincoln said, yes, but they, meaning the Confederates, are green too. You are all green. The troops are poorly supplied. Like we said, they're not even wearing standardized uniforms. However, on the 21st of July, General McDowell, at the urging of President Lincoln and the Northern press, took 30,000 troops and marched towards Richmond. At a place on a little creek called Bull Run, they are going to encounter about the same number, 30,000 Confederates. And everyone starts to know that the battle is coming. Elite society people from Washington leave Washington in their carriages to come down to the battlefield. They bring their wives, they bring their children, they bring picnic baskets. They're going to sit and watch the fun. So let's have a look at what happens. Now, here we go. This is what I'm going to try to do. Battles are almost impossible to understand unless you can see a map. And hopefully this map is good enough for you to see. Okay, let's try this. I'm going to draw this out for you guys. All right. These two roads lead to Washington, and the Union Army comes down this road. The first shots of the battle are fired on the headquarters of the Confederate Army at a house right here. It's the house of a man by the name of Wilmer McLean. Wilmer McLean, let's remember his name. Wilmer McLean is a militia veteran. He quickly leaves the house saying it's too dangerous, obviously. And the Union Army comes down from this road to Washington. There are Confederate troops along here. Those Confederate troops are pushed back upon this hill. However, and it looks, at first sight, these Union troops coming down this hill start pushing the Confederate left south and away, and it looks like the North is going to win the day. The war's over, the battle's over, the war's over, everybody's happy. However, from Richmond, for the first time in military history, reinforcements arrive by rail, and these reinforcements hold back the left side of the line. So by the mid-morning, there are troops, Confederate troops, kind of strung off along this road, and Union troops kind of setting up to fight them. There is a Union attack in the center of the line. Right here. A Union attack at the center of the line, right up the slopes of a small hill called Henry Hill. At the top of that Henry Hill is Henry's house, and the name of the house is Spring Hill. McDowell attacks the center of the Confederate line with some early successes, and the rebel division under the command of a man by the name of Bernard B. starts falling back onto this hill. And his lines are starting to break. Those lines break, the Union Army splits the Confederate Army, and the battle is pretty much over. However, into this scene steps who is going to become one of the most famous generals of the entire war, a Southerner by the name of Thomas J. Jackson. Thomas Jackson he was a West Pointer, came from a very poor family, a fervently religious man, led his regiment of Virginians into the fray. They came up from here, this regiment of Virginians, and tried to plug the line. As General B's troops are retreating and General Jackson's troops are holding the line, General B, to get his troops inspired, yells to them. He wants them to reform and rally and, stand their ground. Turns to his men and says, "Look, boys, look at Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians," he says. And from that day forward, Thomas Jackson's nickname would be Stonewall. And Stonewall Jackson becomes one of the greatest Confederate commanders of the war. And because of Jackson's bravery and because of the skill of his men, the line in the center holds. Which is important because at this point there is now Union pressure all along, especially the left side of this line. And more Confederate troops come up, and the line is being held. Throughout the middle of the day, this is kind of the situation. But as soon as General Jackson kind of strengthens his line and gets everything in order, Jackson decides that it is now time to counterattack. So now from his position in the center of the line, Jackson now counterattacks. Some of his men are wearing blue uniforms. And because they're wearing blue uniforms, the Union artillery, which is set up behind the army, does not fire at them until it is too late. Jackson's men take the Union artillery and aim it at their own troops. From Spring Hill and the Henry House, as soon as this counterattack goes off, Confederate troops from all over the field start pushing the Union troops back. McDowell's troops retreat slowly and with some degree of order from the field, but then when Confederate artillery starts attacking the roads heading back to Washington, the retreat becomes a rout. Back here is Bull Run Spring. General McDowell tries to get his troops to hold a line at Bull Run Spring, up here at the north part of the battlefield. However, they do not. The congressmen and the other elites of Washington that had come to see the show in expectation of easy victory start clogging the roads back to Washington. An artillery wagon is blown up and the retreat becomes a rout. McDowell's soldiers throw down their guns and start running as fast as they can back to Washington, D.C. The Southern troops, who are just as inexperienced as the Northern troops, lack the discipline to chase them down. So they don't. And the Southern troops end the battle on the field, exhilarated, obviously, by their victory. They lack the discipline, they lack the communication to follow it up. All right, so that is the first battle of Bull Run. There will be another one the next year. All right, so the aftermath of the battle. The first thing I want you to do, oh, I can't see myself. The first thing I want you to do is go on YouTube and watch that clip. That's a clip, what's known as the Sullivan-Ballou letter. And take a few minutes, pause the video, it's like 3 minutes long, go on YouTube, watch the Sullivan-Ballou letter. Okay. Now we're back. You've watched the Sullivan-Ballou letter. It's so important to keep in mind whenever we are watching, these things, whenever we are talking about war, we're talking about soldiers, and we're going to start talking about casualties and numbers. Every single death is an individual person. Kids, often, with hopes and dreams and fears, and they fell in love, and they were not much older, and in many cases they were as old as you. And every number of a killed in action was a life cut short. And every number of wounded is a life forever changed. And whenever you study war, you must remember that. You must remember that. Sullivan-Ballou was a particularly literate man and left behind the most beautiful sentiments in the world to the woman he loved. But there was many other, thousands of others, who thought and felt the same things and never lived their lives because of this war, and any war ever fought by humankind. After the battle, Southern morale soared, Northern morale plummeted. People in the North started to realize, you know what? Winning this war is not going to be as easy as we might have thought. That invading and conquering the whole South is not something that is going to be done by Christmas. Congress recognizes this and voted to raise an army of 500,000 for 3 years. Much larger an army than had ever been in the field, ever been under the Union flag, ever before. General Scott was gently pushed into retirement. General McDowell was relieved of the command of the army. And command of the army of this new 500,000, half a million man army, command of this army was given to a 34-year-old man from Philadelphia by the name of George B. McClellan. McClellan had served with distinction as a young officer in the Mexican War, and he had achieved the Union's only success in the war so far, clearing the western part of Virginia of Confederate troops. That western part of Virginia, a non-slave-owning, pro-Union part of the state, would secede from the state of Virginia and set up their own government, and they would be recognized by the Union as the state of West Virginia in 1863. McClellan, who was short, he was a short man, had a fine military bearing, a dramatic flair, an incredible amount of self-confidence, and the ability to inspire the troops. He was a superb administrator, a superb organizer, a superb trainer of all of these new and fresh and green troops. And those were just the qualities that the Army needed after the disaster at Bull Run in July of 1861. McClellan comes in, there's this 500,000 man army, and no one is better equipped than he to organize it, staff it, and train it, and then hopefully to fight it. As summer turned to fall, any thoughts of moving on Richmond that year were squashed by General McClellan. General McClellan was going to take the whole rest of the summer, the fall, the winter, and the spring to actually turn this mass of 500,000 men into an army. He would use this army then, many months later, was his plan, to attack the Confederate capital and hopefully end the war in 1862. That is where we stand militarily at the end of 1861. The last thing to remember, the last thing we need to know, number 5, is the Trent Affair. Now keep in mind, it was a basic goal of the Confederacy to get European nations to recognize its government openly. For France to say, the Confederate States of America is an official independent country. And for Britain to say, the Confederate States of America is an official and independent country. Without that, the South could not really hope to win the war. They needed, just like France recognized the colonies in 1777, the South needed the European nations, especially France and Britain, to recognize them and help them out, just like France had helped the United States in 1777. So the South started sending ambassadors and commissioners to Europe to try to argue its case. In November of 1861, a British ship, the HMS Trent, picked up 2 Confederate diplomats and was bringing them to London. A Union warship stopped the HMS Trent, this British ship, and forcibly arrested the 2 Confederate officials. This is a violation of international law, that a ship cannot stop another ship on a diplomatic mission. That cannot stop a ship is not at war with. The United States is not at war with England. The United States has no right to stop a British ship engaging in British diplomacy. Britain was very, very angry, and Britain threatened war with the United States. Lincoln apologized, released the Southern diplomats to go to England, but there was now some bad blood between the United States and England. England's an interesting case here, that the South, in many ways, is like England. The North, in many ways, is like England. England is torn throughout the course of the war about which side to take. But having the Union kind of stop its ships and interfere with its diplomacy makes the British very angry at the Americans. So as Christmas of 1861 came and went, the war was as far from being over as it ever was. Nearly 1 million men on both sides were in the field training, equipping. Both sides were struggling to turn their economies into war-fighting economies. And of course, there was already several hundreds, in the low thousands, number of young boys that had been killed in the conflict. Northerners and Southerners looked at it and said, what will 1862 bring? An end to the war. Little did they know that 1862 would be the bloodiest year in American history up to that point, and that the losses suffered in 1861 would pale in comparison to the carnage and the horror that was waiting for them in 1862. Happy New Year, America.